Bibles, please flip them open to Psalm 42. And we're going to read the whole chapter. We're going to read the whole chapter today, which sounds like a good undertaking, but it's only 11 verses, so pretty easy. This is my favorite psalm in the entire Bible. I think it's one of the most beautifully written pieces of poetry I've ever read before. And it really hits at something that everyone's going to go through. It's a universal human experience. And it's one that people are trying to find solutions to in our day-to-day. And it's the issue that we call depression. So there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new that's ravaged man that hasn't been there before. So this is over 2,000 years old. Someone wrote about something that people are still trying to figure out today. And I believe that his explanation of what it is, how it feels, and what the possible solutions are miles ahead of anything that our modern day science has come up with. So we're going to read it, we're going to study it, and hopefully we're going to take away some very important truths from it. So Psalm 42, it says that it was written by the sons of Korah. So most of the Psalms, as you guys know, were written by King David. This one was not. The sons of Korah were kind of like their worship band. It seems to have a constantly changing roster, though, so kind of like the Beatles or something. Like it just constantly evolves and changes. It's not really to be a specific set of people, but just the worship leaders of the nation of Israel. They wrote this particular psalm. And it says, "As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, and while they continually say to me, 'Where is your God?' When I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God with the voice of joy and praise, with a multitude that kept a pilgrim's feast. Why are you cast down on my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, for the help of his countenance. O my God, my soul is cast down within me. Therefore I will remember you from the land of Jordan, from the heights of Hermon, from the hill Mizar. Deep calls unto deep at the noise of your waterfalls. All your waves and billows have gone over me. The Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime, and in the night his song shall be with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I will say to God my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with the breaking of my bones, my enemies reproach me, while they say to me all day long, 'Where is your God?' Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God." Let's pray. Father, we want to thank you so much for your word, how beautiful and amazing it is. We do pray that these words that were written so long ago, but yet so relevant to us and where we're at, would resonate with us, that they would help us understand our current situation, draw closer to you no matter what's going on in our lives, and learn to minister and to help others. We love you, Lord, and in your name, amen. All right, so as I said, Psalm 42, very beautiful piece of poetry, incredibly relevant for what we're going through as a nation, I believe. I have struggled with depression since I was around 12 years old. So this psalm has been incredibly important to me. It's been incredibly impactful in my life. And I've been studying it for the last about 15 years. So every time I read it, I get a little bit more out of it. So as I was reading it this week, I got a little bit more insight that I want to share with you guys. But very, very beautiful and amazing. The first thing that's important to understand about depression from the Hebrew perspective, very different than the way we understand it today. So they didn't have a word for depression. They didn't have a word for depression. Instead, what they use is they use things like this. They use poetry, and they use different types of language to express what depression is, but they never actually give it a word. They never actually give it a name. The reason why is because, unfortunately, in our society today, we believe that everything can be boiled down to materialistic explanations. So, in other words, when people talk about depression, they used to talk about things like grief. They used to talk about things like sadness, despair, hopelessness, cynicism, and yes, they would even use the word depression. But all these were supposed to be inner states of man that were very difficult to communicate across the board. So if I use the word depression, it might drum up something inside of your mind, maybe something from a firsthand account, maybe something not. But what it can't do is it can't accurately and adequately express to you what being depressed is actually like. So those of you guys who've never experienced it, me saying that word to you means nothing. Now, what we've done in our culture is we've suggested through psychiatry and psychology that once again, all these things are clinical. I can figure out exactly what it is. I can figure out where in your brain it takes place. And through various drugs and medications, I can alter your brain chemistry and turn off your depression. So in other words, it's a completely subjective experience happening within your own mind with completely materialistic explanations. The Hebrews didn't think that way. The Hebrews did not think that way. Instead, what we see just in the little piece of wisdom of them not giving it a name is that they do not think that depression is something that's purely materialistic. They do believe it is an inner experience of man that can be communicated across the board utilizing the gift of what we call the arts. The purpose of the arts, the reason why we have them, the reason why we even practice them within church, that's why we do worship music, is because what the arts do uniquely, beyond any other methodology of man, is the arts can communicate the inner workings of mankind to other members of our same species. A very famous guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He lived during the Soviet Union and was actually sentenced to the Gulag for many, many years. And he wrote about his experiences and the experiences of his fellow inmates in a piece of work that will take you about 3 days straight, right? If you just sat down today and started reading it and didn't take any bathroom breaks or sleeping breaks, it would take you about 3 days to finish it. But it's the stories of those who made it through the Gulag. Some of them didn't make it, right? Obviously, quite a few of them died. But he committed people's stories to memory, and when he left, he wrote them down in what's called the Gulag Archipelago. And in the Gulag Archipelago, very hard to read, very hard to get through because of just how dense and depressing the subject matter is. He was able to express what the Soviets were doing behind the Iron Curtain that they had kept so well hidden for so many years. And because of his exposure of what was going on in the gulags, the Soviet Union, in no small part, and thanks to him, fell just a couple years later. So it created a public outrage against what the Soviet Union was doing, and it eventually began to crumble their power and their strength from within. Now, later on, a couple years later, he gave a Nobel Peace Prize speech. In it, he made the seemingly naive comment, "Beauty will save the world." And he's quoting from Fyodor Dostoevsky. And what he says in his speech, if you want to read it, again, kind of a long-winded guy, so you're going to have a little patience if you want to read through it. But what he says in his speech is he says, the reason why beauty will save the world is because we now live in a global community. There was a time in human history where the events occurring in Japan or France or England would no more interest you than the events happening in another planet. You just wouldn't care because it would have no impact. We now live in an economy in which things happening in Germany immediately affect us in the United States. And even though these experiences are being translated from different languages, the cultures that are being experienced, that are being expressed, are so wildly different than our own, we have no medium of fully understanding what's going on, besides the arts. So he theorized that because the globalization of the world was becoming more and more dense, and because communication was becoming more and more rapid through the news cycle, if we didn't have a means of understanding other people's experiences, we would eventually grow to hate one another, become far more nationalistic, and eventually we would deteriorate into more and more world wars. So if you want to take what he said with a grain of salt, you can, but if you want to apply what he said to what we see happening on the global markets right now, especially with wars happening in Ukraine, you may want to take a listen to what this guy had to say. That perhaps there's a problem with being able to clearly delineate information very rapidly and very quickly without taking the time and the effort to understand the context in which these events take place and how it impacts the people directly. So, food for thought. Let's focus on Psalm 42, and I'm going to apply that long-winded explanation through which some of you probably tuned out, to what really does matter, right? What really, really does matter. And why I believe that, again, he is correct. When it comes to the issue of depression, if I clinicalize it, if I say this is what depression is, unfortunately, what's happened is many people believe that they are depressed and they actually aren't, because they don't actually know what it is. And you can go into any psychiatrist and in about 15 minutes, slip of the tongue, but in about 15 minutes, you can be diagnosed with depression. They don't do a single brain scan. They don't tell you exactly what's happening. They don't explain to you why it might be happening. They just diagnose you and give you certain medications. I was just talking to a guy, so I'm a counselor full-time. That's what I commonly do at our church. I was talking to a young man the other week, diagnosed with clinical depression, and I asked him how he was diagnosed with it. And he said, yeah, I went to a psychiatrist. I was experiencing these symptoms. I explained to them what my symptoms were, and they gave me this antidepressant medication. And I asked him, what did you explain to them? And he just told me that he explained to them what he was going through, what he was feeling. And I asked him, did they ever ask you what was going on in your life? And he said, no, they didn't. I said, well, what is going on in your life? And, he gives me, to protect the anonymity of the person I counsel, I'm not going to get into everything he's going through. But essentially, his sister had committed suicide a month before he went to that psychiatric clinic. And so they never asked you? They never thought it was relevant to ask you a question about what was going on in your life? And he said, no. Now, that might sound shocking to some of us who are a little bit older, but to someone who's younger, that doesn't sound shocking at all. Because once again, if you go into a doctor with a heart problem, they're not going to ask you about your life story because they don't care. What's diagnosable and what's visible is all that really matters. But psychiatry, the study of the mind, is not the same. The Hebrews, because they wanted to help people understand exactly what was going on, they refused to give this a name. They instead utilized poetic beauty in order to illustrate what depression is like so that people across cultures, across continents, and across time can be able to understand what's happening within themselves and express it outwardly. So how does he express it? Well, the key verse, in my opinion, is verses 1, so we'll read that one again, 1 and 2, and verse 7. These are the explanations of the experience of what we call depression. So again, this is not the causes of it. We'll get to that in a second. This is just what it's like. So verse 1 and 2 says, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? So in verse 1, when he talks about his soul thirsting for God as the deer pants for the water brooks, that's an often quoted passage. Many people quote it. It's in worship songs. I wish that the worship songs that quote it were not so cheery, because it's not a cheery statement. Right? The word here that's used is not describing like a light thirst. It is describing the kind of thirst that would accompany dehydration and death. So this is what depression is. Now, he applies the experience to God, and I'll explain that in a second. But what it is it's a exhausting, dehydrated feeling of thirst for something that you can't quite quench. And it's all internal. So the word that the Hebrews like to use is broken spirit to describe depression. Broken spirit. The spirit, for the Hebrew, it's the Hebrew word ruach, and it means breath or wind. When it's describing what this guy's describing, when it's describing what we call depression, what the Spirit referenced is the internal emotional vitality of an individual. So we've all probably experienced this. I don't know, we live in the desert, so I'm sure you have. Dehydration. Right? When you're thirsty and you don't have any water and you're just walking and drudging around, there's an exhaustion that your body starts to experience. It makes you even get to the point where if you went long enough without the water, you would stop taking care of yourself at all. You would just give up. You would just lay down and die. And unfortunately, again, since we live so close to the border, this happens all the time. There are many people trying to cross the border that die, literally just lay down in the hot sun and die because they're so thirsty. What he's saying is that it's just like that, except for instead of having a physical corollary, it's all emotional. All of your emotional strength, all of your emotional vitality are dried up. You have no drive. You have no passion. You have no interests. Everything seems kind of far away, distant, like you can't really connect with the world around you. Most people describe depression as sadness, and that's just not true. It's not sadness, it's an emptiness. It's an internal void. And oftentimes, and we'll explain this in the next metaphor, that does lead to sadness, or it's caused by sadness, but that's not what it is. It's not the same thing. So let's go to the next metaphor. Verse 7. Deep calls unto deep at the noise of your waterfalls. All your waves and billows have gone over me. So he gives a twofold metaphor here, and he's apparently obsessed with water because they're all water related. But again, they're from the desert, so that makes sense to us. So the first metaphor is that of a waterfall. Now, that seems kind of clear to us. It's a very vivid picture. So when you go to waterfalls, which, again, we live in Tucson, so we don't have any here, but if you go somewhere that has them, and you see a waterfall, what you see this constant stream of powerful water that is bearing down, usually on rocks below, and eroding them. That's what he says it's like to be depressed. He feels as though he is standing underneath a constant pressure that is pushing him down, bearing him down. That's why, by the way, where we get the word depressed from. To depress something is to push it down, right? So he's saying, I feel as though I'm being bombarded with a constant stream of steady but powerful pressure that's eroding me, that's taking away, again, my will, my drive, my passion. Now, the second one is interesting because it seems contradictory. He says, all your waves and billows have gone over me. So he says, in one instance, it feels like a waterfall. It feels like a constant pressure that pushes me down. But in the second instance, he says, it's not like a waterfall. It's actually like being hit with waves. So once again, going out to the ocean and you get hit by a wave, it disorients, it overwhelms you, it confounds you, it stirs you up, it puts your head where your feet should be, and it tosses you over. And this is, again, very synonymous with those who have experienced depression. They'll tell you this is what it's like. In certain instances, you feel like you just don't have any will, you don't have any drive, everything is pushing you down. But in some instances, it feels like strong, overwhelming emotion that floods into you and disorients you over and over and over again. Which is, again, why it's a mistake to think that depression is synonymous with sadness. People who are depressed don't always get sad. Sadness is something that can overwhelm you very rapidly when you're depressed, and it is a common cause for depression, but it is not synonymous, not the same thing. You could also get overwhelmed with anxiety when you're depressed. This is what we commonly call manic depressives, or people with bipolar. That's a new phrase that we use. We don't use manic depression anymore. We call it bipolar. These are people that go constantly from those extremes. The extreme of anxiety, and then they go into the extreme of depression, no feeling. And they bounce back and forth between the two, and they never find really an even keel way of living. But you can get overwhelmed with anxiety, you can get overwhelmed with sadness, you can even get overwhelmed with anger and frustration. Some people who are depressed actually get very violently angry when that emotion takes over them. So again, it's not the same. But any emotion that comes into your life is going to overwhelm you. Really interesting proverb that says, he who has no strength or rule over his spirit is like a city with broken down walls. So the spirit, once again, because it controls the emotional vitality and strength of the person, of the individual, if it's broken, you're like a city with no walls. Anything that comes in can immediately take over. There is no protection, in other words, to keep you from being overwhelmed. Now, you could also learn a lot from just the phrase broken spirit as to why depression happens. So if the Hebrews thought of the spirit in this way, that means when they're describing it as a broken spirit, they're actually thinking of it as like a bone or a muscle. And what causes a bone to break? Pressure. Something overwhelms it and breaks it. It twists it in the wrong way. It contorts it in a way it wasn't meant. This is why, again, most people associate sadness with depression. It's because the most common emotion that breaks the spirit is sadness. So you go through an experience in your life, and either it's immediately devastating and traumatic, in which it will break your spirit right away, or maybe you're just like a Job kind of existence, where it's just one thing after the other, after the other. And the second you can catch your breath, another thing happens, and another thing happens, and another thing happens. And I like the way that the author of Job puts it, where it says the second the servant leaves, right? So the servant comes to him and he's like, man, you lost everything. Your farm just got destroyed. And it says the second he leaves, the next one comes, right? It's just bad news after bad news after bad news, and it just wears and wears and wears on you until it finally breaks your spirit. But there are those people who, again, they become depressed not because an overwhelming amount of sadness comes into life, but you can, even through stress. People who are overly stressed over a period of time can equally break their spirit, or loneliness, or aimlessness, right? Any emotion can technically break your spirit if it's extrapolated out long enough, and if it's powerful enough. It could break your spirit. Which is where grief comes in. And again, it's one that's come out of our culture. The psychological community used to understand the experience of grief. What grief was, is it was an explanation of someone who has all the tendencies, all the experiences, all of the lists of emotions that we associate with depression, but they don't actually have clinical depression. They just went through a hard time. And what they recognized is what's wrong with you is not actually the depression. What's wrong with you is what caused the depression. And we have to address that. And they would do it through therapy. What clinical depression is it's all the same symptoms of what we call depression, but with no cause. You have it because you have it. Now, in the population, I'll explain why in a little bit, but in the population, there's probably maybe less than 2% of the population that will have actual clinical depression. There is something wrong with their brain chemistry. There's something wrong with them psychologically that constantly causes them to fall back into depression even when there's no reason for it. Right? There's a very, very small percentage of the population that has that. The rest of us don't actually have it. What we have is grief. We have external circumstances that have brought us to depression. And therefore, while a drug can abate the symptoms, it can't solve the problem. Because the problem isn't what you're feeling. The problem is what that feeling is pointing to. Much like any other diagnosis. So you go to the doctor because you have some sort of pain, some sort of an ache, some sort of a discomfort. The reason why you go to the doctor is you don't want him to immediately say, oh, you got some pain? Well, here's some morphine. You're going to get a new doctor, hopefully, if he says that to you. You're going to say, I want to know why my body's in pain. What is this a symptom of? What is going on in my body that I'm in this chronic pain? You want them to fix what's wrong. Or, there's that old bad dad joke. I'm a dad now, so I could use it, right? Where you go to the doctor and you say, hey, doctor, it hurts when I do this. And he says, well, stop doing that, right? That's the idea there. You want the doctor to explain to you why you have the particular pain that you have. You recognize that it is symptomatic of something worse. Depression is symptomatic of something worse. Almost always. Almost always. Very, very small percentage of times where it's not, but even then, there are things that you can do to address what's really going on. Because it always has a cause. The cause might be neurological, and it might be developmental, but there's always some sort of a cause that can be redressed. Now, the next thing I want to point out, before, again, we get into his depictions of what's going on here, what is scary to me about the state of our country is that depression is on the rise. Depression is on the rise massively. There was a report listed by the Surgeon General last year about the rising depression and suicidal ideation of this new generation. And it is scary. If any of you have read it, it's about 50 pages. It's about 5 pages of fact and about 45 pages of garbage. But, if you want to read the 5 pages of fact, it's very good because it will help you understand what is going on. What is going on. And it is terrifying. Now, what most people have pointed out is it's not that depression is in existence. It's that we don't know why so many young people are depressed. We have no clue why they're so depressed. It seems as though we are in a state where we've never had more economic development, ever, right? And people pointed this out. We are the literal richest, most prosperous nation that has ever existed. There has never been a time in human history where we've had this much prosperity. Life expectancy has never been higher. The ability to deal with medical issues has never been more succinct. Education has never been more widely available. Why is it that people are so depressed? So to put it another way, and to use a metaphor, imagine that you went into a community of people and all the young people just have broken bones all the time. Now, there's one of two causes for this. Either you would say, either the behavior of the children is more dangerous than others, or there's something in the water. Something's going on here that's just out of the norm. Because if their behavior is the same or maybe safer than the majority of children surrounding them, why is it that they're broken so easily? Why is it that they're broken so easily? And that question has to be asked. Now, quick disclaimer for those of you guys who are listening to this and like, yeah, those millennials and Zoomers, those cupcakes, they don't know what suffering is, and they just complain about everything. And okay, if someone has a broken bone, and let's say they have some sort of degenerative bone disease, osteoporosis or something like that. And let's say they break their bone doing something really dumb. You shake their hand too hard and it shatters every bone in their hand. Now that's the reason, right? The reason why it broke so easily is the osteoporosis. But their hand is still broken. That's not imaginary. Their hand is broken. And you got to deal with that, right? You do have to deal with the broken hand, but you also want to deal with what lies behind the frailty. So if you as an older generation person, you're just like, gosh, these stinking snowflakes, grow up, get a spine, that's actually not going to help. You're right, but you're also wrong. You're correct, there's something overly frail about this new generation, but you're wrong to address it the way you are. You're wrong to address it the way you are. You do have to point out the fact that these kids are depressed. They're not faking it. If they were faking it, you wouldn't see suicide at an all-time high in the younger generations. Right? There's something going on. There is something in the water. And we got to figure out what that is, but we also have to deal with the very real emotional distress that they're in. So, let's talk about the causes. And the causes that he's going to give here are going to point out what is wrong with our country, right? It really will point out what's wrong with our country. So, the first thing that he points to, this is going to sound, obviously, I'm a pastor, we're in church, so clearly I'm going to point this out, but this is important. He immediately orients his feelings of depression towards his relationship with God. He immediately orients it towards his relationship with God. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul for you, O God. In other words, he is experiencing thirst, and his instinct is to say, I need God. Just as if you're in the wilderness and you're wandering around and you're dying of thirst, you're not going to say, I want a T-bone. I want a smoke. I want a Coca-Cola. You're going to infer this thirst is pointing to my need for water. This thirst is pointing towards my need for water. At a macro level, human beings were created for God. That's what we were created for. Jesus, when he says, "Come unto me, all you who are thirsty, and I will give you drink. And out of you will flow rivers of living water." What Jesus is saying is, what your soul is thirsty for is me. It's not a philosophy. It's not an ideology. It's not an education. It's not a vocation. It is a person. It's Jesus. You need a relationship with Jesus. This person understands this. He's thirsty, and he's going to the right source for water. He knows why he's thirsty. Now, that's a macro level. At a more micro level, if I shrink it down a little bit, our need for God is so great. And C.S. Lewis pointed it out this way. He said, as Christians, we need to get out of binary ways of thinking, right? Good or bad, right or wrong. He says there are degrees of good and bad, and there are degrees of right and wrong. So while it is best to have your thirst met in Christ, it's better to have your thirst met in some sort of religion than none at all. It is better. It's best in God, the true and living God, but at least it's better if it's something transcendental. If it's something transcendent that goes beyond your life, it is better. When we remove God from humanity, we remove the transcendent from the human soul. And in fact, a lot of people, even Christians, even people who claim that they are spiritual, they think, because they're so materialistically bent because of our culture, they really think, well, you know, religion, that's something that you do in your own soul. It's not really that important. It's not really that necessary to the human experience. That's why increasingly young people do not attend church, even though they claim to be Christians. They don't see any actual need for religious obligation and experience within their life. They don't see any need for it. They're like, well, yeah, I believe in God. And that's where it ends for them. It doesn't challenge or touch anything else in their life other than their mere straight belief system. That's it. And they think it's enough. It's not enough. Religion, as we want to call it, religion is not some intellectual experience. Religion is a lifestyle. It's a life putting yourself under the transcendent, saying that what is flesh is important, but it is not as important as what is spiritual. And I'm going to live my life for what is spiritual. Viktor Frankl, who's a Jewish guy, went to the concentration camps, made it out alive. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he talked about that. He talked about what was the difference between the Jews who made it in the concentration camps versus the Jews who didn't. And his main point was, if you have a meaning that is transcendent, you'll make it. If you have a meaning that is only materialistic, you'll never make it. You'll never make it. Because any meaning that is physical can be touched by this world. And if it could be touched, it could be destroyed. And if you've linked yourself to it strongly enough, you'll be taken down with it. When you look around the world right now, anyone who puts their value in the world, they're really hurting right now. Anyone who didn't find their main purpose for life in something transcendent is really being devastated right now. It's because everything in the world, the things that we thought were secure, we're recognizing they're not as secure as we thought. They're not as secure as we thought. And part of it's propaganda. Part of it really is people telling us that the sky is falling, sometimes literally. But part of it is the fact that the things that are rooted in the flesh are not eternally secure. They're also not eternally significant. Solomon, in the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, he has put eternity in your heart, O man. He's put eternity in your heart, oh man. What he means is that we tend to, as kids, we don't think this way, but as we get older, we start to think more and more about the fact that we're going to die. We start to contemplate and wrestle with our mortality. And we try to figure out, what's it all for? Once my light blinks out, what has all of it been for? What is it all significant of? Does my life have meaning? If you're simply a materialist, you must conclude it doesn't. And that's crushing. That is soul crushing to people, to really feel, to really know that your life doesn't matter. Why wouldn't you be depressed? You know, I've been quoting a lot of Russians today because they understand depression better than anyone. But Leo Tolstoy, later on in his life, he's, really rich and famous as writers go. Back in the day, the writers were the rock stars, right? And he writes some of the most famous literature ever put forth. And he is depressed, right? He's experiencing depression. And people ask him about it. They're like, why are you so depressed? He's like, I don't know. It's like, I'm wealthy, I'm powerful, I got a good family, my health is good, my mind is sharp, I'm well known, I'm significant. And then he starts reasoning through it, and he says, but then I realized, what can I do today or tomorrow that won't inevitably be wiped out by my own demise? What he meant was, yeah, he's rich and famous now, but eventually he's going to die, and he will be forgotten. He will be forgotten. We remember him now, but in a couple thousand years, we won't. He won't even be a footnote on the history's page, and that's assuming that human beings are still around for a couple thousand years. He realized, why should I live as if I have meaning if I can't ascribe ultimate meaning to anything that I do? So a good way to show people this that was shown to me once is someone asks you say like, okay, would you be willing to meet with me at this parking lot? You give them some address hours away. Meet with me at this parking lot for an hour or two later on today. Now, the immediate question that anyone would ask is, why? Now, the reason why you ask why is because you need to justify that usage of time. Now, here's the inconsistency there. You need to justify wasting 3 hours of your life, but you don't find it necessary to justify your life itself. It's kind of weird, isn't it? We do need to justify our lives. We do need to understand that our life has meaning. When you take away the transcendent, you take away significance. And when you take away significance, you take away people's will. Because that's what depression is, a lack of will, a lack of passion, a lack of drive. Beyond that, we also live in a culture that is constantly affirming to us that we are unnecessary. There are people that are flat out saying that the world might be a better place if you weren't in it. They're saying that we have an overpopulation problem. And perhaps the reason why the world is struggling the way it is because there's too many people. Right? People are the problem. We're raising young men and young women, and we extend their adolescent period where, by the way, in most cultures, when you're 13 years old, you're a man, you're a woman. You start taking part in that culture's society. You start taking your place. You figure out where you belong in that society, in that culture. Here, we don't do that to our children. We tell them, you don't really have a place. Your place is in school. Why am I in school? To go to school. Well, why am I going to high school? So you could go to college. Why am I going to college? So you could get a degree. Why am I getting a degree? So maybe you could get a job one day. Does it matter what job? Not really. We're constantly telling our young people that their life has no meaning. We're ascribing no purpose to it whatsoever. We're not allowing them to take a place amongst us, and then we're shocked that they don't feel like they have one. We're shocked when the young people take their own lives, and in their notes, they're saying, I feel like no one would miss me. And as a parent or as a family member, you say, well, I miss you, I care about you. Yeah, but you need more than that. You really do. You need more than the generic love of people that are close to you. You need to feel like you have a purpose. You got to feel like you matter in some significant way. And we have constantly and consistently instructed people around us, you don't matter. You don't matter. Isn't that what the shutdowns really demonstrated to people? You're not, what do we call it? Not necessary workers. It was essential workers. You're not essential. We literally told people that. You're not essential. Go home. You're not essential. You shouldn't even be out of the house, because you could die. And because you're not essential. So you're like, why should I live? So you could live. But you're not essential to live. But you should just keep living to live. And don't kill other people. That was it. That was what we were told. Right? Kids were, I saw another young guy just a month ago, and I'm getting more and more of these as time goes on. Massively depressed, doesn't know what to do. 12 years old. 12 years old, massively depressed, already experiencing suicidal thoughts, doesn't know what to do. And I asked him, I was like, when did this all start? And he said, well, it started during the shutdown. I stopped seeing friends. I stopped hanging out with people. I said, I just asked him, why do you wake up in the morning? He's like, play video games, study. There's not a single moment in that guy's day that he feels like has any amount of significance. He feels worthless. All of it. This is what this man says, by the way. So he attributes it to God, the transcendent, but then notice what he says. Verse 4, when I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. That's an important phrase that we're going to go through later. For I used to go with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God with a voice of joy and praise with a multitude that kept a pilgrim's feast. Then later on, in verse 6, he says, therefore I will remember you from the land of Jordan and from the heights of Hermon and the hill Mizar. So we don't really know what's going on in this guy's life, but because he's in this band, right, the sons of Korah, we get the idea that the sons of Korah were stationed where the temple was, Jerusalem. Now he is saying that he's in Jordan. So he is moved significantly north of where he's from. And he no longer has his community. He's isolated. He's alone. And that is depressing him. All right, so you take a guy who has a vocation, he's a worship leader. You take a guy who has a solid community built within Jerusalem, and you take all of that away from him. And you think he's going to be happy? You think he's going to flourish? Why would he flourish? Why would he be happy? Right? Our lives need to have some sort of significance attached to them, and that significance is found in our community with others. It's found in our community with others. Once again, another lie that we're telling young people. We tell young people to find themselves. Find themselves. You know what that means, by the way? Honestly, if any of you are curious, like, what the heck does that even mean? Don't you own a mirror? This is what they mean. They mean you need to figure out who you are apart from your culture, apart from your nationality, and apart from your family. Because who are you really? Are you just a result of the nurture of your family and the views and ideals that they have instilled upon you, or the views and ideals of your country or your school or your church community? Who are you really? This is why most young people, when they say, I need to find myself, they separate from everything. And most of you parents are like, oh God, gap year. Yes, that is what kids do now. They take a gap year from college because they're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out who they are. What do they do during that gap year? Nothing, right? They don't do anything because they don't know how to do it. But they do take a separation from all their roles, from all their responsibilities, and they try to find themselves. This is what the Bible is telling us in this passage and many others. You only figure out who you are through connection to others. We're kind of like bats, right? Bats are blind, but they use sonar to navigate. You got to bounce yourself off of something solid in order to figure out where you are. You can't just fly around in the dark and locate yourself. It doesn't work that way. Many people, when you disengage from your community, you'll never find yourself. You will never figure out who you are. You figure out who you are by bouncing your personality off of those around you. And then you discover where you belong in your society. This is what we understand even in the Godhead, in God's existence. Right? If you notice, the members of the Trinity, we define them through their roles. The Father. Who is he the Father of? The Son. Who is the Son? The Son of the Father. That's literally their identities. They don't have one outside of that. When he creates roles, he creates institutions, he creates responsibilities because he wants us to reflect him, because guess what? We're made in his image and likeness. You can't find significance outside of roles because it doesn't exist. when we disconnect young people from all their roles and all their responsibilities and all their institutions, and we say, find yourself, we are setting them up to fail. We are setting them up to fail. They'll never find who they are. Again, this is why we have this giant gender identity problem. You know, no joke. I detail a lot of this because one of my main ministries is to sexual issues. And no joke, this is not, I'm not kidding. There is a new gender out called cake gender. And if you want to call someone appropriately by the right pronouns who is in cake gender, you have to call them cake self or cake person. Again, I'm not making it up. You can look it up later. These are called xenogenders. It's a new list of genders called xenogenders that have nothing to do with sexuality. They have all to do with your personality. And when you ask someone to define, well, what is cake gender? Why would you define yourself that way? They would say, well, you know, my personality is very layered. Or my personality is light and fluffy, kind of like a cake. Right? And that's what they'll say. That's what they mean. Now, it's funny to us. And the reason why it's funny to us is because we realize this is a group of people who has no clue what they are. They have no idea who they are, and they are desperate for identity. They're desperate for any type of identity, even a ridiculous one. They have no clue where they are. They have no clue where they belong in our society, and they have confused applause and likes for genuine relationships, because that's all social media gives you. It doesn't give you genuine relationships. All it gives you is applause and likes. And that's not what a relationship is. A relationship is people that do life with you, that know who you are, that know where you're going, that are there to help you, and yes, there to challenge you when you're doing something insane and foolish. We need relationships in our life. We were built and created for them. When we separate people from these things, we are signing them up to go into this aimless despair at which anything can send them into depression. So again, when you say, why are they so depressed? Everything's going great. As a matter of fact, that will make them more depressed. So my wife last year, I'd be praying for her because they still don't know exactly what's going on. So she suffered like this major mouth injury last year. And so she has this chronic pain that goes on in her mouth. And they can't figure out why. They can't figure out why. They've given her caps, they've evaluated surgery, things like that, but she's just in this constant chronic pain in her mouth, and they can't figure out what's going on. One of the dentists she saw, he, as kind of a joke, she didn't find it funny, he said, well, you have something that we call suicide syndrome. And she says, what's that? It's where you're in constant life-altering pain, and we have no clue why. And it drives you to want to kill yourself. One of the worst things that your doctor could say when you go in, right, is what he said. But, you know, one of the worst things your doctor can say when you go in and you have legitimate pain is, I don't know. I would way rather the doctor say, you have this horrible diagnosis over here, than to say, I don't know. Because at least if there's a diagnosis, there's something you can do. There's no diagnosis, then you are just consigned to constant pain. When you're depressed and you don't know why, that is the worst and most torturous thing to go through, because that basically tells you this is just how my life is going to be. And anyone who's been through depression, it's horrible. It's hard to find the strength to get up in the morning. It's hard to go to work. It's hard to eat. It's hard to talk to people. Everything becomes more difficult when you're depressed. To say this is just who you are now is crushing. It's soul crushing. You know, you can't really recover from something like that. You really can't. And so once again, if you have this idea of, I am depressed, I don't know why, well, I guess it's just nothing I can do about it, suicide seems like a pretty tenable option. Because what kind of quality of life are you really going to have you live the rest of your life in this mind-numbing depression? Another mistake that we've made is we've ascribed the depression of young people to things that can't change. To things that can't change. So if you read the Surgeon General's report, the rest of the 45 pages is saying, well, the reason why kids are so depressed today is because of gun violence. It's because of global warming. Okay, great. So you're telling young kids You're depressed because gun violence happens. In general, not even gun violence has happened to you in your community. Gun violence just happens in the world. So what you're saying is you've given them a reason for their depression that won't change. It will never change. Now, if you say, well, we could get rid of guns, we could be more, okay, maybe we can, right? Maybe we can. But violence between human beings will never change. And is it really better if someone gets stabbed to death or shot? Will you really be thankful of, oh, at least he didn't shoot me in the face, thank God it's just a knife, or a car, or whatever other usage of violence that human beings will create. We're pretty good at killing one another. We've been doing it since we've been created. Since Cain picked up a rock and smashed his brother in the face, we've been pretty good at killing one another. That's not going to change. If you tell a kid you're depressed because violence happens in the world, you have basically told them you will be depressed for the rest of your life. But what you've done is you've given them a framework, and this is what we've done to young people. We've given them a framework that roots their depression in the news. So if you wonder why young people are so obsessed with the news nowadays, that's why. We've told them the reason why you're depressed is because of the news. Not even the news in your immediate family, it's because of the news around the world. So they're constantly searching for reasons to be depressed. They're actually hunting for it. In counseling, we call this pain shopping. That's when someone is internally hurting, struggling, but they don't know why. So they actively look for reasons. They actively look for reasons to be depressed because they want something to root themselves in. So what's the actual solution? So the first one is expression. What is the purpose of art? Is to communicate the inner workings of man. There is a mistake that especially a lot of Christians make to believe that art is meant to be uplifting. Well, we read this entire psalm. What's uplifting about it? There's hope in it, right? He does admit that there is some hope that he's holding on to. But you get to the end of the chapter, he's still pretty bummed out. Right? What's the last verse? Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? That's present tense verbs. He is not out of it at the end of the psalm. He is still depressed. You go to various other psalms, read Psalm 88. Read the very next psalm, Psalm 43, which some believe actually was part of this psalm, kind of like another verse that was added later. But you look at it and you realize, why do we have worship music in the Bible that begins and ends on a depressing note? Why do we have that? It's because depression is a universal human experience, and one that if we don't know how to appropriately express and understand is far more devastating, because not only is it painful to be in this state, it is far more painful to feel alienated in this state. One of the greatest things that happened to me when I read this psalm, I don't know this guy. I don't know anything about him, the guy who wrote it. I know nothing about his life. I know he lived several thousand years ago on a completely different continent than me, completely different life circumstances, and yet when I read his words, even today, they resonate with me. I know exactly what he's talking about. When you're depressed, one of the worst feelings that you have is nobody understands what I'm going through. So you don't express what you're feeling because you feel as though no one would understand it even if you did. Whenever someone sits down and they counsel with me, the first question I always ask them when they're telling me about their issues is I say, have you told anyone about this? Does anyone in your life know that this is what you're going through? Obviously they know you're hurting, but have you told them the specifics? 9 times out of 10, they say no. They say no. And I try to point out the logic there. Say, okay, so you're willing to sit down with a stranger, someone that you, in a lot of cases, you don't have to pay me, but a lot of cases you have to pay for their time. You're willing to tell it to them, but not the people that are closest to you. You know why? It's because they're terrified about being judged by those that they know. They don't want to be misunderstood. They believe that I'll understand them because I do it professionally. But they're terrified of depressing and being a burden to those around them. And they're even more terrified of being misunderstood. We absolutely need more art like this. We need more art like this that tells people about the necessity of expression, even negative expression. Because even writing it in a psalm, right, he's not just expressing it, he's putting it to music. He's putting it to harmony. He's using poetics to make it beautiful. Even though it's deeply depressing, the mere existence of it is beautiful. It's very much like Michelangelo's Pieta, which is, I think, arguably the most beautiful statue in existence today. Those of you guys who haven't seen it, it is a depiction of Mary holding Jesus after the cross. Now, the subject matter is unbelievably grief-inducing, right? Mothers, when they look at it, it's just, what would it be like to hold your son after he dies, right? There's nothing uplifting about it. It's not the resurrection. It is just Mary weeping over her son. And in fact, the word pieta means pity. But yet, when you look at it, you can't help but say it's beautiful. It really is. It's beautiful. And it's because, again, how many people looking at that statue can relate? You can say, maybe I didn't physically hold a loved one as they died, but maybe I did. But I know what it's like to grieve the loss of someone that I really loved. I know what it's like to just be in that place of sorrow. Again, over about 1,000 years old, close to 1,000 years old at this point. And yet, I mean, half a millennium old at this point. And yet, we can relate to it. We could see what he was expressing through it. When I was writing my book on post-traumatic stress, one of the therapies that they introduced me to was called art therapy. I thought it was really interesting. It's very fascinating if you ever study art therapy. And I put it in my book because it's the only type of therapy that the Bible actually says works and talks about. Now, it says that it works in a really interesting story. There's a guy named Saul in the Bible who's kind of a bad guy, but eventually he experiences depression. Some modern-day psychologists have been like, he seems a little bipolar, and I would agree. Saul does seem like he has bipolar, legitimately, the way he acts. But there's only one thing that soothes him. You remember what it is? David plays a harp for him, and it calms him down. And some people, it says that he has a distressing spirit. Some people think that that's a demon, but remember what spirit means, right? Spirit is him. There's something wrong with him that constantly causes him to go into this distressing state of mind. And David alleviates it with the harp. Now, what people have figured out modern days, why that works, is because beauty, the arts, uniquely have the ability to transcend the logical part of your brain. And it communicates directly to your emotions. That's why a lot of people, when they do art therapy, they listen to classical music. They actually don't listen to music with lyrics. Because classical music is communicating emotion simply through tones. And it's powerful. And it's poignant. Right? By the way, one of the reasons why classical music has fallen out of vogue recently is because it's kind of like, one of my favorite movies is Beauty and the Beast, because I like Disney for some reason. And there's a funny moment in the movie where he goes to Belle and she's reading a book and she talks about how she loves it so much. And he picks it up and he says, "There's no pictures. How can you like this?" When people can't appreciate music that communicates so deep and poignant things through tones, it's basically like saying there's no pictures. I can't understand what's being communicated because they're not directly communicating with me. A lot of our music today lacks any subtlety because people lack imagination. They don't have the time to just sit and listen and understand what's being communicated to them. If we learn how to understand the expressions and experiences of others, it helps us unite ourselves to our own experience and then gain the language necessary to express it to others. It's very powerful. And I always encourage people to understand it. The second thing is he learns how to communicate with himself instead of just ardently listening to himself. This is a repeated refrain. Why are you downcast, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? So he communicates to himself, and he's introspecting. He's trying to figure out what's wrong, why he is the way he is. In our society, once again, if you believe that everything can be dialed down reduced down to the physical, that means that your emotional state is who you are. Is who you are. This is why identity in our country is reduced down to feeling. If you want to ask a young person, why do you identify this way? They will come up with a feeling. They'll be like, well, I feel this way. Because they believe their emotions literally are reality. They think they're the truth. We've forgotten something really important. Emotions are depictions of your subjective experience. They aren't necessarily in congruence with reality as a whole, though. So a good example of this is if I look out and my eyes are perceiving something right now, they're perceiving the doors, right? That's a reality, but I am having a subjective experience with it, one that none of you can actually share with me. You could look at the doors yourself, but my experience with it is totally different than yours, and that's okay. We have subjective experiences. However, if I say, well, I see a cow, then you're going to be like, you're kind of crazy. Your internal experience is not in congruence with reality. I'm not denying that you're having the experience, but what I'm saying is it's wrong. The way you feel is wrong. Have you ever even thought that way? That the way you feel can be wrong? It's not that you're not feeling that way, but perhaps the way you're feeling is wrong. You shouldn't be feeling that way. If you don't know how to do that, then you don't know how to fight your emotions, and they will take over your experience. You need to have something outside of yourself that dictates the terms of your experience. Otherwise, you're a puppet to whatever emotional, internal experience you have. You have to learn how to do that. Most young people today don't even know that that's a truth, that your internal experiences can be wrong. They absolutely can be wrong. And therefore, they ought to be challenged. Next thing, this is important. You notice he doesn't wait for an answer. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you disquieted within me? And then he moves on and he tells his soul to do something else. Again, I love counseling. I think it's great. But there's a problem with counseling. When counseling was discovered, when it was first started to be propagated, the big problem was a lot of people were dealing with their problems through repression. They weren't dealing with them at all, in other words. That was the problem. Nowadays, the problem is not that people struggle with expression or introspection. It's that they get lost in themselves through narcissism. They spend all day looking in the mirror, and then they don't understand why they have no greater clarity of who they are. Right? Counseling can be a constant narcissistic act of perpetually navel-gazing. Just looking in the mirror. Why did Adam and Eve experience shame in the garden? It's because they experienced themselves. They looked down. They were naked and unashamed as long as they were able to focus on things other than themselves. But shame crept in once they started to introspect. Now again, it's not that introspection in it itself is wrong. It's good. But if that's all you do all day, if all you do all day is try to figure out who you are, like you're some really, really special, significant person, and you really think that that's the most important thing you can do, you will never find significance or health or anything like that. You will become a narcissist. What he realizes is it important for me to get this answer? Yeah, and I'm going to think about it a little bit, but I'm going to be patient for the answer. I don't know when I'm going to get it, but I'm going to direct my focus to praise. The enemy of depression is hope. It's hope. What is your hope? A hope is an expectation of good. It's an earnest expectation of good. What do you hope for? What are your hopes in life? What are you aiming for? What are you shooting for? What are you trying to accomplish? You got to have some sort of a substance in order to develop that. He says hope in God. for I will yet praise him. He has absolute confidence that God is working in his life, that his life matters, it has purpose, and God is working out his good and important purpose within himself. He has confidence that this will happen. He doesn't know what it's going to look like. He doesn't know how it's going to be, but he believes that it's true. And sometimes just a little bit of belief is enough to get you through the dark times. In Hebrews 6, it says, hope is an anchor for our souls, both sure and steadfast. Sometimes an anchor is enough to get you through the storm. And if you don't know how to weather the storm through this anchor, through this hope, that's sure, that's steadfast, that's real, that's rooted in reality, it's not intentional self-delusion, where you're just this interminable optimist who tries to see sun when there really isn't any. But you're someone who really genuinely believes that there is hope in this world. And you know where to look. You know where to look. As Christians, we know the ending of the story is happy. And what that means is that the ending of your story will be happy. Even those who are going to be martyred for their faith, even those who are going to die in horribly wretched ways, just as your Savior did, you know that your story is a happy one because it has purpose. It has meaning. It will matter in eternity. If you don't know where to look for hope, once again, and you are hopeless, even if you could turn off the depression in your brain, you're still depressed. It is a weird thing to hear people say that when they're on antidepressants. They say, I can't feel it anymore, but I know I'm still depressed. It's like phantom leg syndrome, right? It's there, but they just can't feel it anymore. Sometimes feelings are a gift in that light because at least they ground us in some way. But those are the important things we have to understand. Find what we're looking for. Find what we're hoping for in your life. What is your community? What are you connected to? Who are you connected to? What are you living for? And then understand the amazing hope and significance that's within God. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you so much, again, for your word. It's beautiful beyond compare. I do pray that these words would sink in, that they would help us and encourage us wherever we're at, that we would learn if we are in a state of depression, that we would learn to hope in you, God, knowing that these things don't immediately take away the experience of depression, but they give it grounding, they give it meaning. They give us a reason to continue to fight and pursue. They give us a reason to continue to live our lives in order to glorify you, God, in order to experience you more. And for those who aren't, I pray that they would take these words to heart as well, knowing that they can be a significant help to those around them who go through this, and that they are prepared that even when this dark night of the soul approaches them, they have resources and strength within you, Lord. Grant us courage, grant us hope, and in your